Thank you to those of you who are joining us. Our subject today is Brazil, climate change, and the conference taking place in Brazil as we speak, COP30. The United Nations Climate Change Conference is planning to address nearly 20 topic areas. Just a couple of these are adaptation and resilience, capacity building, climate finance, climate technology, migration, oceans. We are now a decade beyond the Paris Agreement. And a lot has changed in the last year. Growth in carbon dioxide emissions have fallen significantly from about 2% to 0.3%. There is 15 times more solar capacity and 3 more times wind capacity than was forecasted 10 years ago by the International Energy Agency. And my understanding, our participants can correct me if I'm wrong, but that renewables have now exceeded coal in electricity generation, another significant change. But this conference is taking place against a global political economy background that is both complicated and increasingly fraught. And many of our longstanding institutional issues are fraying. So today we have with us 2 professors from the Schar School's Global uh, Commerce and Policy Program. Professor Valerie Laxton is with the World Resources Institute. She is an international economist. She is an expert on global governance and, importantly, climate finance. Professor Mark Langevin is a senior advisor and expert on Brazil-US trade, energy, and agricultural policy. He has just returned from Brazil and is very active in this space. And we're going to work through a set of questions with these 2 individuals until about 12:40. And then we will open things up for questions from any participants. So let's begin. I have a question for Professor Laxton. Our climate conference is the 30th of these. Okay, so there have been a lot of these. I wonder if you might just give us an overview of the role of these conferences in global climate policy.
Of course. So the Conference of the Parties, or the COP,
Mhm.
is really the main decision-making body of the UNFCCC, the UN's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the parties are the countries. And the COPs are the space where countries negotiate and agree on collective commitments, targets, and rules for climate action. So the role of a COP, well, it's central to how the international community coordinates decisions and provides guidance for action on climate change.
Mhm.
These meet annually, so at the annual COPs, countries commit politically, set expectations, and they create frameworks that guide implementation. For example, in 1997, back then, COP adopted the Kyoto Protocol, where
Mhm.
industrialized countries essentially adopted emissions reduction targets, or COP21 in 2015 was a big milestone because the countries and parties came together and agreed on very important items. Number one, pursuing common goals in a universal framework, where countries submit nationally determined contributions. And number two, a method to make progress on these goals. And so countries committed to progressively raise ambition over time and to a reporting mechanism. So each COP helps operationalize the framework decisions about transparency or reporting or finance, such that all the different stakeholders, countries, financial institutions, etc., can take action. So in some, COP aims to create space for agreements, legitimacy through how they include and bring consensus, and they ensure continuity through these annual cycles of negotiation and reporting that really help translate global decisions into national action on the ground.
So in your assessment, this is a lot more than just show and drama. There are
Yes.
substantive things taking place. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. These there are commitments that carry political weight and then that are translated into national action,
Mhm.
and that really has an impact on the ground.
Right. Thank you. Professor Langevin, Belém, Brazil. That's where this is all taking place without adequate hotel rooms, if I'm fully informed. Uh, As a trade economist, I've watched the nature and degree of involvement of Brazil in trade policy increase substantially over time. Might you give us just an overview of the current broader role of Brazil in global governance?
Yeah, and I think I think it does start with Rio 92, which
Mhm,
is the event held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, Brazil hosting kind of a global environmental arena to discuss all sorts of
mhm,
issues. And that really set off a kind of a global focus on the environment and initially kind of climate change. And secondly, putting Brazil kind of front and center in that arena as representative not only of themselves, which is a huge natural resource
mhm,
country with, territorial sovereignty over about 80% of the Amazon, um, but also it placed them in a unique position diplomatically and scientifically. So Valerie mentioned COP15 in Copenhagen. Just I think before around, I think Valerie might be able to remind us the intergovernmental panel on climate change,
mhm,
which was this all the scientists, the engineering school at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, COPI, had a couple members on that panel that received the Nobel Peace Prize. And
Mhm.
so a lot of people think about Brazilian diplomacy as kind of the only hitter. Actually, Brazilian scientists studying climate change were right in the forefront as well, and part of that Nobel Prize winning team of scientists. But really, over time, Brazil has asserted itself in all respects in terms of global governance. Of course, they're at the forefront of a reform at the World Trade Organization.
mhm,
With respect to the COP and climate action process, while taking a couple years off during the Bolsonaro administration,
mhm,
once Lula was reelected for his third term in October of 2022, he immediately went to Egypt and made the case that Brazil should host a COP and it should be in the Amazon.
mhm,
And I think he won that and got the COP30 here. And, for since Copenhagen, the COP process has turned into both negotiation, constituency, stakeholder showmanship, but it's also been a place where national governments have hosted the COP looking to get more domestic support for their policy agenda, whether it's energy or what have you. And I think Brazil represents that in its most crystal clear fashion, that Lula wants to influence global governance economically, environmentally, but he's also realizes the value in domestic politics of hosting big events. Now, he was single-handedly responsible for bringing the FIFA Men's World Cup football tournament to Brazil in
mhm,
2014, the Summer Olympic Games in 2016, and now he's brought the cup. So I think that it's just fair to say that Brazil, under this kind of social democratic political formation, it
mhm,
wants to be a leader in global governance, and the COP in Belém, the COP of of truth, as Lula likes to put it, and as the president Lago likes to say, implementation, implementation, implementation. It really puts Brazil kind of right where it wants to be, near center stage in this whole global governance drama over the future of the planet.
So this is a lot more than just COP. There's a much broader scene out there that Brazil is trying to partake in. And I really appreciate your mentioning of the science angle of this. That had, is something that I had not thought through and realized carefully. So that's important to keep in mind. Professor Langevin, no, Professor Laxton, you actually work in climate finance. So, and at the same time, within the Global Commerce and Policy Program, you teach global political economy. You and I are the people who teach that class in the program. Could you just say a few words about the overlap between these realms? How do you see climate change and climate policy as being situated in this larger realm of global political economy?
Yes, certainly. So that's a big question. So to me, climate change and specifically climate finance is a very good example of where global political economy analysis can usefully be applied.
I'm going to
And
start taking notes then. Okay.
and why am I saying that? Well, in part because global political economy is the study of the relationship between politics and economics, right? So
Mhm.
it helps understand why policymakers and societies make choices and allocate resources the way they do, and what are the global implications of these choices. So just like trade policy, reducing economic inequality and policies to do that, or policies to foster economic development and growth, climate change generates specific policy choices and options. And what makes it of interest to global political analysts is really that it has multiple and differentiated impacts on different groups in a society, right? And across countries around the world too. Climate change, for instance, there are some countries that are experiencing more severe droughts and less predictable rainfall, and that hits the livelihoods of certain people working in the agricultural sector, the small farmers, for example, disproportionately compared to others who are more urban populations. Countries that are facing rising sea levels versus those that are not, and that are landlocked. So it hits coastal communities when the sea level rises, or it hits infrastructure that is located there much more than in places that are not close to the rise in sea levels. So there are also a slew of extreme weather events that we have been witnessing, very recently, notably in Jamaica, and events are becoming more frequent and more severe. So climate change is having different impacts on different groups within society, which implies that policymakers are attentive to how voters will view how their elected officials will respond and how climate action is financed. And they'll convey that in domestic elections. So for the domestic political economy, it makes, climate policies a good candidate to do case studies about the domestic political economy and dynamics within a country. But also the fact that climate change is having impacts on different countries around the world, it implies that the actions to address that global challenge will garner more or less attention, more or less support, or lack of support by different countries. And that's prime material to shaping alliances,
Mm.
coalitions of countries, or different types of coalition between public and private actors in the context of international negotiations, as well as within international institutions that we study in global economy classes.
Mhm.
So, international finance for climate action, which is the finance that's provided by developed countries to developing countries is even more so a matter for global political analysis. It's very interesting as a case study to study the power relations and power imbalances between countries in global decision making. And it's really about how power institutions, domestic and global, and the incentives shape finance for climate action and on what terms, who benefits from it, and who does not. So that's how I view the relevance for global political economy of this phenomenon.
So all the things that we originally had in, say, the political economy of trade policy, all of this carries over to the climate realm.
Very much so. The analysis of the interests, of
Mhm.
the beliefs, of the perceptions, all of these stakeholder analyses that we pursue of who is affected, who benefits, who loses, definitely that carries over.
All right, thank you. Very interesting to hear that. Professor Langevin, you work on energy issues, you work on Brazil. Brazil is hosting this conference of parties, but if I'm reading, financial press correctly, Brazil's also about to become one of the five top petroleum producers in the world. So on the one hand, you have the Brazilian government promoting petroleum production and exports. On the other hand, it is trying to push the Tropical Forest Forever initiative. Is there a tension here, if not a conflict? How do you see all of this working together?
Yeah, I think one of the edges of this political economy is just the schism between prices and profits, right?
Hmm.
Policymakers, as Valerie indicated, are very sensitive on prices. And we know that political disruptions usually begin with food or fuel prices.
Hmm.
Um, on the other side, investors, whether they're smaller but wealthy, looking at quarterly returns, institutional investors like pension funds looking at annual returns, or the operators themselves, they're looking on return on investment. And right now, we've kind of won the renewable energy on prices. We know that wind and solar is much cheaper than coal, natural gas, nuclear, or any of the fossil fuel energy systems at this point. Yeah, we have to figure out who's going to pay for interconnections because it's a distributed system and so forth.
Hmm.
But the raw energy produced is so much cheaper. That's not to say that renewable energy systems aren't, don't have their own negative externalities with the environment. We're talking about critical minerals and electrification. There's plenty
Right.
of dirty things that go on in that side.
Hmm.
But when you're going to drill a well at 3,000 meters below sea level, you're talking about $200 million just to to drill an exploratory well. And so the return on investment is much higher.
Hmm.
Um, some estimates, British Petroleum put, wind and solar return on investment at about 5, 6, 7% a year. These lucrative oil plays in Brazil offshore, we're looking at 13, 14, 15% return on investment over a 30-year span. So shareholders, and that includes mom and dad with their pension, for every increment of renewable energy, they have to pick it up because institutional investors rig their game at about 8% annual on average return on investment. So
Hmm.
if they lose on renewables, they got to pick it up somewhere else. Well, there's tobacco, there's there's drugs, there are weapons, and there's oil and gas. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement and financing the energy transition is that the smart investors are looking at investing in technology that they can license, not to slap up solar farms because they're just not as profitable as many of these other things, including lucrative oil and gas plays. So that brings up the question of, well, yes, we're going to need some oil and gas and so forth. We obviously want to phase out coal. And I don't think the cops have done enough to focus on phasing out coal, because if we get rid of coal, that's half or more of the battle,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of emissions. But there needs to be more attention paid to, especially in the financing realm, of phasing out what we call marginal plays, marginal wells, and then also the expense of decommissioning them. So after they stop producing oil and gas, they also stop emitting carbon and methane into the atmosphere, which is also a problem. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to build in all of that. And, COP may not be the right arena to have these more precise debates about how to team financing with displacing fossil fuels. But it does get in the headlines around the world, so we can have the debate here, today, and in our classrooms and out in the public about, what to do with, how do you finance the displacement of fossil fuels and also clean it up at the same time.
Mm-hmm. But if I, all of that's really interesting, but what about Brazil, and the fact that it's trying to bridge these two worlds? Does that put the
Well, I think
Brazilian does it put the Brazilian government in an awkward position?
Well, I think Brazil is the critical case study. In terms of renewables, it has a much higher content than the world average. The world average for an energy matrix, about 15% renewables. Brazil's up around 33%. So it's off to a good start, right? And that's mostly hydroelectric power and
Right.
biofuels and
Mm-hmm.
cogeneration from those biofuels. So it's off to a good start. Now, 2 decades ago, when they found the pre-salt reservoirs at
Mm-hmm.
about 3 to 5,000 meters below sea level, very lucrative oil, low carbon oil, if you're into grades of oil, by the way. So it's like it's the best oil for the
Okay.
environment if you have to choose. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
um, Brazil's most renowned energy policy making scholar, Jose Goldenberg, proposed a hypothesis that the rents from the pre-salt would finance the energy transition.
Mm-hmm.
2 decades later, we're still debating that hypothesis, and we're still kind of figuring it out. One of the things that we know is that the new frontier basin in the very northeast of Brazil, called the Foz do Amazonas, even though it's not really in the mouth of the Amazon River, it's quite distant. It's closer to Guyana and Exxon's play.
Mm-hmm.
It's out kind of in the ocean. But anyway, that looks like it could be a lucrative oil play. And the adjacent state, Amapá, one of the poorest in Brazil, the gross domestic product of Amapá is equal to the royalties that the state of Rio de Janeiro receives from oil and gas production in that state. So you can see the
Mm-hmm.
asymmetry. And
Yeah.
also, well, yeah, the upper middle class in Sao Paulo don't want to drill any more oil, but talk to the very poor Brazilians living in that region of the country. This could be the opportunity of a multi-generational cycle of wealth accumulation. So it's
Right.
a really contested, as you suggest, Ken, highly contested. We've just seen recent public opinion has shifted from, no, let's not drill in frontier basins in Brazil, to, well, this basin looks really good up near French Guiana. So let's
Mm.
drill there and see if we can't find something
Okay.
historic.
All right. So it's back to the issue of different groups and their interests, as Professor um, Laxton mentioned. All right. Thank you very much. Professor Laxton, um, in the realm of climate finance, I imagine that there's a lot of discussion of different instruments that might be coming on board. Could you give us a sense of that realm and what these financial instruments are and what they might contribute?
Yeah, so that could deserve a 2-hour answer in and of itself, but I'll try to summarize my thoughts around that, because I think you're asking this question because climate finance, as
Mhm.
such, is a relative latecomer in the
Right.
global financial landscape, right?
Yes.
And so this field really is seeing the emergence of financial instruments and vehicles that are being used for climate purposes. And they're often designed to mobilize capital for mitigation, to reduce emissions, or for adaptation, for building resilience, for example, and for nature finance, which is dedicated to nature-related investments, and that's a bit separate. But climate finance is an area where we can use traditional financing instruments and put them to new use, basically. And these vehicles, instruments, or structures are also some new ones are actually being created, and that's where the innovation is happening. So I'll try and distinguish those. They can address mitigating emissions or adapting through instruments that help reduce or manage the risks from climate change. So I'll give you a few examples of where traditional financing instruments are put to new use. Grants or concessional loans. A grant doesn't need to be repaid, right, by a developing country, for example. And it's provided for a specific purpose, and it's used typically for projects that might not generate future cash flows or will not. Then there are concessional loans that are generally provided by financial institutions like development banks, multilateral development banks or multilateral funds, and they're lent on more favorable terms than market loans to developing countries at lower interest rates or with longer payments to repay these loans. And these are classic instruments for climate finance, but they can be used in climate finance ways. So MDBs, I mentioned them, the multilateral development banks, because they are large providers of climate finance. They use them a lot, these grants or concessional loans. But then you also can use green bonds. So a country or a company might issue these bonds to finance specific projects or specific outcomes, to invest in renewable energy or clean transport or resilient infrastructure, for example. And a newer version of that is the sovereign sustainability linked bonds. Sorry, it's a mouthful, where the coupon on that bond is tied to climate performance indicators, and that creates a financial incentive to climate action or raise ambition, basically.
So that's an innovation. That's
That's
something
an
new.
innovation, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then relatedly, about debt conversions or debt swaps, for instance. They've been used traditionally to create fiscal space or headroom for investing in development so that countries can invest in health or education and such. Now, some countries are using them to reschedule part of their debt and create headroom against their commitment to investing into improving conservation outcomes. Countries like the Seychelles, Belize, Ecuador have used such debt for climate swaps or debt for nature swaps to protect marine areas, for instance. And that is quite helpful, and that's a new use of those debt conversions. And then you have a whole large spectrum of blended finance vehicles that are much talked about. And they're there to mobilize private finance alongside, or to mobilize different types of finance. It can be private finance, philanthropic finance, etc., alongside concessional public capital. And the problem that these types of structures or vehicles are trying to solve is really that there's a high risk perception sometimes of climate projects, because investing in renewable energy projects in very low income countries or in contexts that it's the first time where investors have not been exposed to this type of investment. They're not familiar with climate investments. These types of structures help by including, for example, guarantees or first loss mechanisms or some kind of technical assistance window that when it's associated with some private capital, it helps reduce the risk that a private investor alone would not be willing to take because of the risks associated to it. And so it's interesting in global political economy terms because it really makes us think about who bears the risk, what type of risk are the different stakeholders willing to take in these different structures. Are the resources that are highly concessional and coming from multilateral development banks or bilateral ones like the donor countries or bilateral donors, are they used effectively? And most effectively, are they truly transformative and additional to what they would usually do? So these are pretty complex structures that take some time to set up, but they can be really helpful. And then there are also broad initiatives that are sometimes called programmatic approaches that use pooled instruments, and they're becoming more widespread, and probably the Tropical Forest Fund that you were alluding to earlier can be part of that kind of approach. And definitely more of these pooled instruments are used in the to finance adaptation because it brings together capital from very different sources, and then the capital is allocated to multiple projects or a large region, and it's often for complementary development and climate outcomes. So it could be a public-private partnership to develop a large water facility for a whole region. It could be for a group of countries that are facing similar extreme weather risks like cyclones, and they want to pool risk and manage it across different islands, for instance, different island states. So it helps investors in these pooled facilities balance the risk, both the political risk and the financial risk that is associated with two specific countries. So it basically helps them diversify and balance the risks. It lowers the barriers for an investor for investing in protection, reducing the risk of climate related events, or the risk of investing in adaptation for which there is uncertain returns. And it really helps share physical and financial risks associated with these extreme weather events.
Wow, that is a very well encapsulated overview of an entire field of finance.
There's a lot more.
I'm sure you could teach an entire course on this. I see a hand. Professor Matt Goose, did you have a specific question on this issue?
I kind of wanted to ask Professor Laxton, like you talked a lot about mitigating risk with green bonds. And by the way, that was like the most excellent overview of the subject.
Yes.
I learned a lot from hearing you. But like in terms of actually making these, bond issuances profitable, you talked a lot about mitigating risk and, being backed by international organizations, but like for private investors to actually invest in this, do you have any thoughts on what might spur that?
Yeah, well, the private investors might also issue their own corporate green bonds, and that is really interesting because they can raise capital with objectives with commitments towards investing in sectors that they deem appropriate and that will generate revenues over time. And it's usually a longer term vehicle that is really helpful to carry out these investments. And when it's the issuance comes from a country, that really helps envisage those long-term transitions and transformations into long-term activities that the issuer wants to carry out for itself. When the instruments are more blended finance, I think that is also what you were alluding to, Matt, when you asked your question. When there's a public-private coupling of capital in such an investment vehicle that is blended, it's really important to understand who is willing to bear which portion of the risk in those vehicles, and to make sure. And that is why some of these vehicles take a long time to materialize and structure, because the different layers of risk that is taken by different entities is tailored to the risk return profile that the investor is willing to bear.
All right, I'm going to stop there on that particular question. Thank you, Professor Laxton and Professor Goose. I think that we've put our finger on something there that might be worth developing a bit more. This is clearly a field unto itself. So I'm very glad I asked that question. I'm going to go back over to Professor Langevin. You, in one of your many roles, spend time trying to brief U.S. officials of various kinds. At the moment, the subject of today, climate, has been sort of eliminated from U.S. government policy considerations. But if that were to change, and you had a platform for a brief amount of time, what would be the bullet points that you would want to hit for U.S. government officials?
Well, I think the current administration is kind of hot into the race for critical minerals. And
Okay.
the reason that we're talking about critical minerals is first and foremost the electrification. Now, of course, there's DoD applications, there's other manufacturing applications, and then one critical mineral, potash and potassium, is critical in terms of agriculture and fertilizers. So there is interest in the administration, obviously, in pursuing, even through public finance and the Development Finance Corporation, critical mineral plays. I think it's just about building that backwards to basically understand the entire value chain, which is throughout that electrification spectrum of equipment and technology,
Right.
and so forth. Yeah, and I'm not speaking for the administration, but that's a logical thing. I think in terms of what we're seeing is, there's a global trade-off between building gas pipelines and interconnections of distributed solar, wind. And Valerie was getting at this point that it's much easier to build gas pipelines because private investors will almost do that on their own if they get the permitting. The interconnections are a kind of a public good that is a synergy between, system operators, some public utilities, private investors, really, really, really difficult. And we're seeing this kind of play out in Texas and other places in the United States, as well as around the world and so forth. But I guess I'm trying to make the segue to the financing part, that maybe the reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation, the XM Bank, will begin to take a look at for the first time, is that one of the major criticisms at this COP30 has been toning down the criticism, obviously, of adaptation, because the financing has been increasing, not to the satisfaction, but whatever. But it's the slow rollout of these big project financing mechanisms. So a lot of people think that for every 100 million donated to these facilities that Valerie mentioned, and including potentially the Tropical Forest Forever facility, only about 15 million gets out. And so one of the things that I think this administration could look at, and then of course COP30 and so forth, is designing financing mechanisms that aren't about risk. They're about local stakeholders organized in communities and cooperatives. Now, we have a really rich experience here in the United States of community solar. the incoming administration, the state of Virginia, is likely to ramp up the community solar framework. So we'll see a lot more in Virginia. Maryland has really ramped up and so forth. When I was in Brazil just a couple of weeks ago, I was at Brazil's first community solar project up in Babylonia, a very poor community in the hills of Rio de Janeiro. So the whole idea is, how can you roll out money faster to people and their organizations that can stand up solar panels very quickly? These are the kinds of things that I think the current administration hasn't, in a sense, grappled with, but because of their own constituencies,
Right.
this could be a thing. For example, in Texas and Florida, these are the fastest growing solar states in the United States. Now, they don't have state level community solar frameworks for incentives and so forth. They almost don't need them because the private sector can finance and project develop them and so forth. But how could a federal administration really use the experiences of Florida and Texas, not only around the United States, to really squeeze out subsidies? Of course, that would also including squeezing out subsidies for natural gas fired electricity, but also apply that to foreign policy, to international economic policy making,
Right.
whether it's through COP or whatever, right? And I think that's, maybe Valerie and I might agree on this, that, there's going to be COP special financing, but really the game is project financing around the world. Who's assuming risk for major energy projects? And the bias is on major. I think the future, the transition lies in smaller scale, decentralized power generation.
Yes.
With the public good being the interconnections, and then the completion of the electrification value chain that isn't profitable and the market's going to fail at.
So I'm going to open this up to our audience in a second, but we are in an era with an increased number of extreme climate events. And wouldn't it make sense to therefore think more carefully about distributed power systems, which might be more resilient? You might take out a piece of that in an extreme climate event, but other pieces might still be operable rather than to have centralized systems. Can I just throw that for a quick comment from the two of you? Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist.
Yeah,
I always like the elegance of just a carbon tax. But anyway, any kind
my
of,
next question. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think like small scale is going to solve the mitigation thing alone. But I
Okay.
think we do need to make polluters pay. This was a mantra, decades ago. Make polluters pay for national and global funds that are directed to adaptation and emergency response for,
Okay.
intense weather, climatic events.
Professor Laxton, just a very quick comment on that, and then we're going to open things up.
Yeah, a quick one on that. I think it's not an either or, decentralized systems versus centralized,
Thank
especially
you.
when you look at the latest report by the International Energy Agency and the outlook for energy demand growth in the coming years and where that energy demand will come from. It's really important also to have very strong centralized systems, I think, that will be able to sustain and provide for that demand for energy, especially in countries that are developing their own industries or manufacturing capabilities, and there are high demands that will continue to come our way. There are growing populations in most of the developing and emerging countries, and energy demand is there to stay. So I don't think we can count solely on decentralized systems, but it is definitely an area where we here have a lot of investment to do.
Okay. I have a number of more questions, but I want to pause here to see if there's something from one of our participants Ken Smith question.
Yeah, I first got interested in this when you advertised that you were going to have this. I don't know whether you had an opportunity to read the articles, the 2 articles that I sent you for pre-reading. I also sent them to Mark yesterday. Uh, I want to get back to basics. I'm still on the borderline here. I'm a project management type, a statistician type, retired USAID senior official in many countries. And just looking at the numbers, I don't understand why they are talking about a 1.5 centigrade increase in something from 1283 to 4, when I looked a couple of times at the weather around the world. The mean is right now at 27 degrees centigrade, and the numbers don't make any sense. They're way
Okay.
above these 15 degrees centigrade or Celsius, they call it now. Way beyond any of these statistics that the UN keeps pushing. I don't understand where their numbers are coming from. The other issue is that I wrote an article a couple of years ago when I was first getting interested in this on game theory in terms of political who's better off at doing this. And it doesn't make sense for the US to be riding along trying to do something when China is so obviously overwhelming in coal development, and then telling the rest of us that are not in the business to use solar. So they're selling us their solar stuff while charging on developing coal. I'm very concerned about pollution, and particularly the need for reforestation. And so I thought, I've written a couple of articles in the Project Management World Journal. I've got no response. And as an old graduate of GMU, I thought this would be an opportunity to get some feedback from some of you.
So I'm going to ask
thank you.
Professor Laxton to just say a couple words about targets. There's 1.5, there's 2.0, and then I also see I think if I'm correct, we've kind of already hit 1.5, and forecasts are that we're going to be up, 2.5. So could you just give us a quick summary of the role of targets in all of this?
Yeah, so targets are really important. And as was mentioned before, the scientific evidence shows us that these are kind of thresholds beyond which risks increase much more sharply. And
If I could interrupt,
excuse me, sir, let's let Professor Laxton answer.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is based on the IPCC, the expert scientific panel's work. And therefore, these targets are based on physical limits of cumulative emissions that generate global warming on the planet. And it really acts as having, these targets. These are really the thresholds beyond which risks are increasing, and that difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees reflects points at which scientists start thinking about tipping points where major Earth systems start to change in a way that is hard to reverse. So it's really very important to bear in mind that, okay, maybe in reality, these thresholds will be reached one year or another year. But if cumulatively and over a number of years in a row, we are crossing these thresholds, we increase our risks of seeing tipping points occur in Earth systems, major Earth systems that regulate our planet.
And maybe
Well,
just following up on that, if I could
the
just follow up on
mean
that.
is 21. The mean is 21, and you're talking about going from 12 to 14. It's ridiculous.
Okay.
Let me just follow
So
up
where
on
do
a
they get their
real
base
case, because
from?
we
Okay.
can't get lost in the numbers, because scientists will dispute around the edges. What we do know is that the planet is warming up. And for example,
Yes, I
I spend a
agree.
lot of time with farmers in Brazil, in the breadbasket, the center-west region, home of the Pantanal, which is the second largest wetland in Brazil next to the Amazon. It's currently under drought conditions. Now, 20, 30 years ago, farmers in that area complained about too much water, having to deal with too much water. Now they're complaining they don't have enough water when they need the water. So regardless of the numbers, regardless of the politics, what we know is that the planet is changing, and it has a direct impact on the way we use land, and that's an emission rich area. And also, as Ken knows, this global trading system that puts a premium on efficiency as it revolves around costs and prices, but not on the emissions related to transport and logistics. So we're kind of caught in this thing where now we're having to do all these things at the same time, both in transport, land use, and so forth, to address maybe not specifically the numbers, but just growing challenges to the output, whether it's agricultural, whether it's, these other kind of climate related issues, including, for example, offshore oil and gas drilling, for that matter, or offshore wind production and so forth.
All right, I'm going to next ask, because we only have 7 minutes left. Other participants, does anyone want to unmute or throw something in the chat, or is everyone good? Because I've got another question. If everyone okay? All right, so my next question to Professor Laxton. So you and I are international economists, and this relates to something that our political science scientist just mentioned. From the basic microeconomic theory of externalities, we have Pigovian taxes. That is our go-to policy instrument, and so. Why are we not talking more about carbon taxes? Why do we need to talk about lots of fancy financial instruments and climate finance rather than just having a carbon tax, or in the absence of a carbon tax, some kind of tradable permit scheme, the so-called cap and trade? What is keeping us away from that?
So really simple. You're right. You're absolutely right that in mainstream economics, a carbon tax treats the negative externalities, and that idea is the obvious go-to. And the policymaker incentivizes businesses and consumers to reduce carbon emissions. So that is the basic mechanism. But even though that is the theory, in practice, politically, it's very difficult to implement because it makes the costs of carbon really very visible. It tends to raise fuel and energy prices, and it triggers pushback amongst consumers, industries, etc. And one example that takes me close to home is the yellow vests in France. It was argued that people, living in rural areas and having to drive cars to sustain their livelihoods were going to be very hard hit by such a rise in the carbon tax. So compared to people living in cities who didn't depend on cars that much, that took them to the streets. And so politically, it's very complicated to set up. But that's for, domestic countries. And internationally, so far, governments haven't even moved in sync on these issues. So the result that we are seeing is a rather fragmented landscape of different countries, regional schemes, rather than a coherent, concerted articulation of what a carbon price could look like across countries, so that it gains traction. And governments themselves are completely worried about the impacts on different groups within their societies, within their constituencies, and about the risk of backlash. So they have differing interests and priorities. So across countries, such a scheme is complicated to implement.
All right, we've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to give Professor Langevin 2 minutes and Professor Laxton 2 minutes, and I'm going to interrupt if you go over. What last words would you like us to hear regarding COP30 and climate?
Well, I'll start and give Valerie the last word. I don't think there's enough talk about the indirect subsidies to coal, oil, and gas.
Thank you.
There's huge. If you go
Yes.
to Oil Change International, you can see for the United States just tons of subsidies that add up into billions and billions of dollars. Yes, it would be great just to slap a transparent carbon tax, methane tax, and so forth. Short of that, I think we need to address more the subsidization of the fossil
Yes.
fuel industry, right? Because there's room for a lot of different energy plays, but if we could see each of their true cost, removing the subsidies, it's not just the United States that's removing subsidies for solar and wind. I mean, they can pay for themselves, basically. So we're moving into this place where we really need to clean up the policy space of energy so that we can see things clearly and make good decisions about which energy systems are in the public good and which should be promoted as lucrative enterprises and others that are just a drag on the economy, public health, and whatnot.
All right. Thank you. I'm entirely in agreement with that. I have a chapter of a book that talked about that. Professor Laxton, a last 2 minutes.
Yes, completely. I'll double down on subsidies. That was definitely my number one. But if I have a number two to choose from, I'd say resilience and investing in adaptation is really an investment for the future. And that is one of the areas of focus of COP30 currently. So it helps. Why do these investments help protect our future generations? It's because they protect people, they save lives. Building resilient buildings from scratch instead of, retrofitting, etc. That has a way higher costs. So it really strengthens economic activities, livelihoods, and protects communities against the impact of climate change. So that should be an important realization in all countries and drive, some of the efforts that are done at national level to plan ahead, to really put the budgets where they are needed, because that spending is not wasted, and it benefits and creates more than what is actually initially invested over the span of 10 years. And we've got literature that shows that. So it's really key for countries to see investing in their own resilience as investing in the future.
Thank you. That puts us right at 1 o'clock. Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Langevin. Thank you, Professor Laxton. In the background, thank you, Corin, for bringing this together and setting up the Zoom meeting. Thank you for those who spent this hour with us. We greatly appreciate it. And I love doing this because I get to learn, and I'm in more of a passive role rather than at the front of the classroom. So this has been really fantastic for me.
I learned a ton in the past hour. That's great.
Yeah, yeah. So thanks to everyone. And we are here at the Global Commerce and Policy Program if you would like to talk to us. Thank you.